more than a century, the great powers of Europe and America fought in position to control this rich, beckoning region Native Americans already called home. The invaluable route of trade connecting the waters flowing to the Great Lakes and the Atlantic with those flowing through the very heart of the American continent, down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Nations and peoples claimed it, warred for it, lived for it, and died for it. Fort Wayne was dedicated by General Anthony Wayne on October 22nd, 1794.
That glorious gate, through which all the words of our chiefs must pass, from the north to the south, and from the east to the west, it has always been ours. Michikanoqua, Chief Little Turtle, 1795.
Strategically positioned in the heart of the Old Northwest Territory, that glorious gate to which Chief Little Turtle referred was an invaluable connecting point, route of trade, power, and the exchange of ideas and cultures. Geographically, the Glorious Gate was a short 9-mile portage connecting the St. Mary's River and the waters of the east with the Wabash and the waters of the west. On one end were the three rivers, where the St. Mary's and St. Joseph rivers flow together to form the Maumee, providing passage to the Great Lakes and Europe. France, England, and America would all try to claim and control the vast interior of the American continent by concentrating efforts here at the Three Rivers area, but not before the Native Americans would have their day. Led by the fiercely strategic Miami people and their allies, the Native Americans held back the advancing whites longer here than anywhere else in the country. These are the true stories of courage, love, bravery, and daring that came to be Three Rivers in time.
Perhaps the people of each generation feel the discoveries and advancements of their own age are the most important of all time. But never has it been more true than with the dawning of the New World, both for the Europeans who came here and for the Native Americans already here. By the mid-1600s, French and other European voyagers and traders were already seeking their freedom and fortune here. But there are no written records of their exploits in what was to become Indiana, until French explorers René Robert Cavelier de La Salle and his chronicler, Louis Hennepin, reached South Bend in 1679 and met a Native American tribe called the Miami.
At that time, La Salle met with the Indians, particularly the Miamis. And from that time, he encouraged them to move over to where Fort Wayne is today and establish what was known as Miami Town or Miami Post.
The French wanted control of the valuable portage at what was later to become Fort Wayne, and they found a trustworthy ally in the Miami.
The word Miami means ami, my friend in French. The Maumee River is just a corruption of the word Miami.
Although French explorers were the first to record their presence in the wilderness, freebooting fur traders had undoubtedly been there for decades before.
Joliet remarks that the Indians already had guns. And this is kind of interesting. Now here we have the first explorers coming, and yet how could the Indians possibly have the guns to begin with? Well, the explorers that made diaries were not the first French here. The first French were these traders that used to wander through the wilderness. They did not take notes. Most of them were illiterate. They couldn't write if they wanted to, and they wouldn't make maps because they didn't want anybody else to know where they were.
The Europeans would give goods for the animal furs. Why anybody would want all these beaver pelts was beyond them, but if they're going to provide in the trading atmosphere steel tools and copper pots, the Indians were very happy to do business.
Speaking of the late 1600s, early historian Wallace Bryce notes,
The traders began early to form matrimonial alliances with the Indian women and are said to have lived quite amicably with them.
The French could work well with the Miamis. The French were not interested in land claims. They didn't plan to administer any government program and own the land and control the people. They were simply here to exploit the fur trade.
The newly arrived explorers La Salle and Hennepin had been sent here not only to explore new trade routes, but also to convert the natives to Christianity, a task which was often politely frustrated by the Native Americans.
When one speaks to them of the Christian religion, they applaud all we say. They think it incivil to show the least suspicion of incredulity, but they pretend likewise that we pay all deference to the reasonings they make on their part. They reply that they have listened to all we have said, and that it is want of judgment to interrupt a man that speaks, and to tell him he advances a false proposition. They leave everybody at liberty in belief. Louis Hennepin, 1680.
The earliest known records of European presence at what is now Fort Wayne is that of Jean-Baptiste Bissot de Sieur de Vincennes, who in 1697 was ordered by the French Governor-General of Canada to re-establish a French post already here.
By 1697, there was already a going community here. Fort Wayne, at least document-wise, remains the oldest continuous community in Indiana.
Traditionally, the Miami had called their village at Three Rivers Kikiyanga, often translated as the Blackberry Patch. Vincennes' son, Francois Vincennes, built the first fort here.
We know of some very early activity, but the first French fort was a place called Fort Saint-Philippe, or Au Poste Saint-Philippe, which also is called Fort Miami, as they frequently did, just naming it after the native peoples here, which was built on the St. Mary's River near the modern-day Van Buren Street Bridge. And that place was built in 1721.
This area is the key to the West. Francois Vincennes, Fort Miami, 1734.
A new French fort was later built on the St. Joseph River, just above the Maumee.
The Miami became very powerful in the region because they controlled this very important portage. The Miami charged fees for people to go over it, to use their portage. They also improved it, just like modern people would improve an area that they would want to charge tolls on or charge fees to use. There were bridges and culverts, and there were services offered, bearers to carry goods and horses when they got horses later on to be rented, or mules. Supplies, of course, to be purchased, and all sorts of trading going on at either end.
Floyd Leonard, or White Loon, a Miami chief today, talks about Native American life in those early days.
Life was one of, I think, genteel kind of life, farming and gathering, and a life of happiness along the old northwestern area.
Usual day in the life of the children would be, first off, they would be awoken by the fathers. The fathers would rap on the children's. They did sleep on a bed platform. They did not sleep on the ground, as most people think. And he would then start telling them the stories of the grandfathers, because that was their schooling or their teaching.
With the arrival of the Europeans, Native American life was undergoing dramatic change.
The coming of the cooking utensils, the other things that the white man brought made a big difference in the life of the Indian.
While the natives and Europeans found their opposing cultures difficult to understand, they found similarities in their natures as well.
Accounts of Indians being immoral is indeed a European view. Indians likewise viewed Europeans as immoral in their own way. They viewed Europeans as being particularly odd in their religious practices, or in their sense of what is right and wrong. There were things that they could relate to, warfare, for instance.
Soon, Europeans were not only bringing their goods, but bringing their wars to the new continent as well. Old frictions between France and England spilled over into the American continent as the French and Indian War.
The French wanted very much to preserve that relationship, preserve this area. The English at the same time saw an opportunity to extend a war they were having with French in other parts of the world.
The Miami found themselves squarely allied with their French trading partners and their warrior compatriots, the Ottawa, and in 1754 they were face to face with a young George Washington, commanding an army of American colonials aligned with the British. Decisively beaten twice by the French and Indian forces, Washington narrowly escapes death at the hands of Miami and allied warriors.
Washington himself always considered the Miamis as the main Indian enemies, funny enough. And this continued right through for the next 30 years after he became president.
Ultimately, the British and colonials were able to defeat the French and Native American forces. In the peace treaty between Britain and France, England claimed the entire interior of the continent, including the French fort here. No one consulted the Indians.
The English came with a very largely different attitude. Very arrogant, very determined, very set in their sense that their own culture and civilization was far superior to that of the native population that they found here, that they were very happy to receive food when they were starving, but as soon as they got both feet on the ground, they were very happy also to view the native people who lived in the wilderness as the very embodiment of the devil.
One of the Native Americans feared most by the British was the Ottawa chief Pontiac. Pontiac visited the Miami at Kikianga a number of times, passing a war belt among the chiefs here, writes 23-year-old Ensign Holmes, British commander of the garrison here.
Since my last letter to you, wherein I acquainted you with the bloody belt being in the Miami village, I assembled all the chiefs of the Miami nation, and after a long and troublesome spell with them, I obtained the bloody belt. This affair is very timely stopped. Ensign Robert Holmes, Fort Miamis, 1763.
Holmes was wrong. Encouraged by Pontiac, the Indians tried to take the fort by force, but failed. Chief Legris and a prominent French trader looked for a way to outwit the fort's young commander.
Ensign Holmes made a big mistake. Apparently he was enamored of a woman in the Indian village who was enlisted in the Indian cause, apparently by Chief Legris, as a young man in his prime, to entice Ensign Holmes, the commander, out of the fort on the premise that somebody was ill. And he came out, whereupon two sharpshooters killed him. And the rest of the garrison, demoralized, having seen their commander killed and then scalped, gave up.
They cut off Holmes's head, brought it to the fort, and threw it into the corporal's bed, and afterwards killed all the garrison except 5 or 6, whom they reserved as victims to be sacrificed. Captain Thomas Morris, His Majesty's Armed Forces.
Years later, Mrs. Laura Suttonfield, one of the early white residents of Fort Wayne, gave her account of the relationship between Holmes and the young Miami girl.
I became acquainted with an Indian woman in 1815. My family lived neighbors to her at Fort Wayne for several years. She had a son of some years. The old squaw remarked that he was English. From the age of the man and her inferences to me, I believed this man to be the son of Ensign Holmes. At the time of Pontiac's conspiracy, she was forced to act as she did toward Holmes. Mrs. Laura Suttonfield, Fort Wayne, 1815.
Although the fort was taken over by the Miami during Pontiac's rebellion, it was not used as a military post, and the Miami remained largely neutral to Pontiac's overtures, preferring to rule their own fate and wait for the day the Miami themselves would rule the most formidable army of Native Americans ever to resist the oncoming forces, the Miami Confederacy, led by its brilliant war chief, Little Turtle. By the time of the Revolutionary War, the Miami were the most powerful Native American force in the Old Northwest. British Colonel Henry the Hair Buyer Hamilton went through the portage in 1778, reportedly paying up to $5 for every colonial settler's scalp the native population wished to supply him.
Scalping and torture and murder and mayhem on the frontier is a long and awful part of the history of this region, and it was indulged in on both sides.
There was a mass murder, 95 Indians in Ohio, Ganahatan. Delaware, and others. And they were harvesting their corn. They had no weapons other than what they used to hunt with. And a group of soldiers, small group, came over from across the river and said, "Come back to the village. We want to protect you because there's hostiles in the area." So they took their corn and went back. The women were separated and put into one house, men in another. This guy in charge found a cooper's mallet. He said, "This'll do." So he brought the men out one at a time and clubbed them to death. A woman was brought out as he was clubbing all the women and children to death. And she said, "Please," she spoke English and pleaded for her life, but he mashed her brains out. This is what really infuriated the people here, and this is probably why, even though they were outnumbered and outgunned, they were able to defeat these armies because of what happened. Inside of them, it gave them the courage to fight on.
96 Christian Indians were killed in that massacre. 34 were children. The next American expedition into Indian Territory was attacked, and over 100 Americans were killed, including its commander, Colonel William Crawford, who was burned at the stake. But the Revolutionary War came directly to the Miami village here at Kikianga in a curious way and changed forever the life of a young Miami warrior named Little Turtle. During the American Revolution, French aristocrats and freebooters began coming to America to aid the colonists and in search of fame and plunder. On the ship from France with General Lafayette was one Auguste de la Baume, who, making his way west to Kaskaskia on the Mississippi, headed back east picking up over 100 men and supplies along the way, with a mind for taking Detroit by way of the Miami portage.
And in preparation for an attack on Detroit, La Baume took it upon himself to attack Kikianga. They did so in 1780, and they burned the villages. The warriors weren't here. They pillaged. There was raping that went on. The Frenchmen who were here as traders living among the Indians fled for their lives.
After days of burning, stealing, and looting, La Baume and his men set out across the portage area to return to the Wabash, camping the first night near Aboit Creek, where they enjoyed a considerable amount of rum plundered from a Frenchman's storage house at Kikianga.
In the meantime, the young Little Turtle, a warrior from the Eel River region up near Churubusco, came back to the villages of Kikianga and found what had happened here. Outraged, put together a party of followers who tracked down La Baume and his men.
Their Little Turtle and the warriors were waiting for them to settle in for the evening after having their fill of rum.
And in a brilliant ambush, killed most of them.
There were over 100 of de la Baume's men killed there at that spot. That episode pretty much launched Little Turtle's career as a military strategist.
In the end, the British were unable to defeat the American colonists, and at the Treaty of Paris in 1783, England relinquished control of the Old Northwest to the American colonies.
Nobody spoke to the Indians about this, who happened to live here. And so when Americans began to view the Old Northwest as theirs, and people began to cross the Ohio to take the land, then the Indians began to fight back.
The two cultures had a totally different view of land. If you were a Euro-American, you had to clear it and build on it. Now, if you were Miami, you used it to hunt on.
Now the Native Americans were losing their traditional hunting grounds in game-rich Kentucky, where any hunting parties needing game for their hungry tribes had always been welcome.
And that might have been one of the most abrasive things that they did, was cut off that safety valve hunting area that we had.
Of course, the Indians thought of the land, and we still think of the land as the land belongs to everyone.
We didn't think you could divide up your Mother Earth and you take this and I'll take that and that sort of thing. And that's why the idea of colonization and people coming in and claiming the land and so forth was completely foreign to our people.
I cannot forbear observing that the Miami village points to a very important post for the Union. George Washington, 1784.
But for now, the Miami and Shawnee rule the Old Northwest Territory, as the new cash-strapped nation is powerless to stop their surprise hit-and-run tactics. Indian raiding parties often take white children captive.
They would capture white children and bring them into their homes, and they were treated just as well as if they were a natural child, a Miami or any other Native American child.
Such was the case with a young pioneer boy in Kentucky, William Wells.
He went out hunting with a group of friends, and while out hunting with friends, they were captured by a raiding party and brought across the Ohio River up into Indiana. And his friends were left in a village south far enough that they managed to get away and go back to Kentucky, and reported that William had been taken further north.
Though we have no record of how young Wells was treated by his captors, the following is an account of a similar raid on a Kentucky settlement in May of 1780.
I was about 10 years of age. We were attacked by Shawnee Indians. Part of my family was killed and the rest taken prisoners. We were separated from each other, except for my little sister, who was taken by the same group that had me. My sister was small. They carried her for 2 or 3 days, but she cried and gave them trouble, so they tomahawked and scalped her and left her lying on the ground. After this, I was transferred from one Indian family to another several times. I was treated harshly, and they called me a white dog. Till at length I was considered a member of one of the families. After this, I was treated like the other children of the tribe and given an Indian name. My white name had been George Ash.
Before long, William Wells is adopted into a prominent Miami family.
He was just a young boy at 10 or 11 when he was taken by the Indians and brought up to the Eel River region, where he was adopted by Chief Picayne, raised as his son, trained as a warrior, played the games, gambled, ran in the woods, hunted and fished along with the other Indian boys, and he seems to have taken to it very, very much. When his family tracked him down and made the very dangerous journey to come to find him in the Eel River region to convince his captors, his adopted family, to let him go, to come back to his Kentucky home, William Wells refused.
Called Wild Potato or Carrot Top for his red hair, Wells finds he has the right combination of wit and daring to not only incorporate but excel at Miami life. He takes the adult name of Black Snake and marries War Chief Little Turtle's beautiful daughter, Sweet Breeze.
William Wells is an opportunist. He's a warrior of the highest standing. He's feared by other warriors. He has terrific courage. He is a man who has one foot in each world, one in the Indian world, one in the white world. He seems often at a loss as to which one he ought to be in.
Eager to prove himself in battle, Wells has come to the Miami at the right time.
Miami town became the seat of terrorism on the frontier as raiding parties from this region, from Kikiyanga and the surrounding region, made their way back across the Ohio, raiding as far away as nearly the border of New Jersey.
President Washington confers with his revolutionary friend, now Northwest Territorial Governor Arthur St. Clair. They agree to send the United States Army under General Josiah Harmer into the wilderness in 1790 to attack and chastise the Indians at Kikiyanga. With regular Army troops and a force of Kentucky militia under Colonel Hardin, Harmer's forces total over 1,400 men marching northwest from Fort Washington at present-day Cincinnati. Hardin reaches the Miami village first and, finding it deserted, plunders the village, destroying a reported 20,000 bushels of Miami corn, vegetables, and some cattle. Then leads 300 militia to raid Indian villages northwest of Kikiyanga.
The little army of 300 were now strangely separated in the forest several miles from camp. The enemy, lying in ambush, were numerous. Wallace Bryce.
The campaign of 1790 ended in disaster for Harmer. Lightning assaults on scattered Indian villages resulted in ambushes set by Little Turtle, which nearly wiped out some of the raiding parties. The Kentucky militia were terrified of the Indians and they fled.
The cause of the detachment being worsted yesterday was entirely owing to the shameful, cowardly conduct of the militia. General Josiah Harmer, October 20th, 1790.
The next day, Harmer proceeds to march his weakened army back to Fort Washington. But when encamped for the night, he's approached by Colonel Hardin, who feels the Miami have probably returned to Kikianga and requests a detachment.
I propose to steal and march upon them. As I've been unfortunate the other day, I wish to have it in my power to pick the militia and try again. Colonel Hardin, Kentucky Militia.
That night, Colonel Hardin leaves camp with 340 militia and 60 regulars under Major Willis. Delays cost the Americans their surprise advantage when the daylight of October 22nd catches them about to ford the Maumee River.
The goal of the U.S. Army was to cross the Maumee, push the Indians across their village lands of Kikianga against the waiting forces along the St. Joseph River and destroy them.
But as Willa's regulars ford the Maumee, they're mauled by Little Turtle's sharpshooters, hidden in crossfire positions across the Maumee. Yet the regulars push on, only to be nearly wiped out as they reach the Kikianga village. One of those shot in the river later recalled,
I received a severe wound and, as my only means of safety, remained quiet in the water until all had gone. A large number of men fell in the river, rendering the water quite bloody, so much so that, though quite dry, I would not drink it. I crawled toward the bank of the river and hid. When it grew dark, the Indians came to the river and began to strip the bodies, exulting greatly over their victory. It sounded like the chatter of a parcel of blackbirds. When all was still that night, I left my hiding place. Moving down the Maumee, I made my escape. Private John Smith, U.S. Army Regulars, 1790.
Harmar had lost 183 men in just 4 days.
Harmar and his ghost-like troops finally reached the safety of Cincinnati on November 22nd, 1 month after being beaten at the Battle of Kikianga. His only victory came with the burning and destruction of the Miami village right here, which set in motion the groundswork for the greatest Native American victory ever, when we return with Three Rivers in Time.
General Harmar's invasion of the Kikianga village had served as a call to arms for the Miami and its allies. Meanwhile, Northwest Territorial Governor Arthur St. Clair pays a visit to his old revolutionary friend George Washington.
St. Clair went to Philadelphia, and he laid a plan out before President Washington and Congress and said, I'll build a series of forts from Fort Washington to the Miami town every 20 or 25 mile. And then when we get there, why, we'll eradicate the Indians.
Beware of surprise. You know how the Indians fight us. Beware of surprise. George Washington, 1791.
By the summer and fall of 1791, only a portion of the supplies promised by Congress have arrived in Fort Washington for St. Clair.
You have to remember that those expeditions were being fed and provisioned by a federal bureaucracy, and I don't know if you can see the humor in that situation.
The young American nation, already $25 million in debt from the Revolutionary War and still owing soldiers of the Revolution back pay, is unable to supply St. Clair with the supplies or men he'd been promised. But in September of 1791, St. Clair marched from Fort Washington with some 1,500 troops and a little over 300 Kentucky militia. Tagging along were about 300 civilians.
A lot of these fellows brought their wives along, the soldiers, and their mistress. There were ladies of the night, and washerwomen, and then there were a lot of settlers who wanted some of this rich land that they had heard about when General Harmar was up north. A lot of his soldiers came back to Kentucky and said, hey, there's good land up along the Maumee, what is now the Maumee River.
As governor of the Northwest Territories, St. Clair was used to extended travels in the frontier. But by 1791, advancing age was gaining on his vigor, and he was ill most of the march. Spying on St. Clair's every move was the young Shawnee warrior Tecumseh.
Tecumseh, as there's quite a few reports, he was a very fine scout. he stayed right in Cincinnati by the Fort Washington and had scouts going up to Little Turtle telling them what was going on.
Also hindering St. Clair's advancement was the undisciplined actions of many of the Kentucky militia.
On October 31st, there were 60 people deserted the Kentucky militia, and they said that they were going to attack and get some supplies off of the supplies that were coming up the Wilderness Road. Well, St. Clair decided, hey, that's my lifeblood, you know. Like Napoleon said later on, the army travels on its stomach. So he sent Major Hamtramck and the 1st Infantry Regiment, 300 men, back down the road to guard his supplies. And of course, they were not with him then when he got here.
On November 3rd, 1791, St. Clair's weary forces reached the Wabash River, but his maps didn't show the Wabash, and he mistook it for the St. Mary's, thinking he was just 15 miles from Kikianga. Perhaps tomorrow he could strike the Miami stronghold and be on his way home.
What's extraordinary about the battle in many ways is the organization that Little Turtle brought to the Indian forces that united to stand against the United States Army in defense of their homes.
Little Turtle had decided to march out and meet St. Clair in his home ground, so to speak, in the wilderness.
They may have been experienced in the colonial, the revolutionary experiences, but those were a lot different than the warfare and the tactics that they were going to find coming up this way.
He knew there were Indians, but he didn't. I'm sure he didn't figure there was the number that was camped about 2 miles north of here.
While 2,000 Miami and Allied warriors patiently waited for the surprise attack at sunrise, the Kentucky militia, often feuding with St. Clair over his stricter discipline, chose to camp ahead of the main body across the Wabash.
It was a pretty good encampment, but Little Turtle just outsmarted them. They took out the 3 guards who were to the east of camp. They killed the one to the south and the one to the north, and they had them surrounded.
Natives were in position and watching and being very patient in the bitter cold that morning.
They knew that the soldiers' weapons would all be stacked, that they would be least prepared to meet an attack at that moment.
They waited until everyone left their post to go enjoy their camp breakfast, and all hell broke loose.
Cowbells, whistles, shouts, screams.
First they spooked the Kentucky guys who were on the other side of the stream. And so they came and got in the way of what soldiers might have got some pretty good shots at the Indians.
Then, on a given command, why, they started shooting from all around the encampment, like shooting fish in a barrel.
Every Indian is a perfect marksman and never fires at random. General Arthur St. Clair, 1791.
They attacked in a typical fashion that Little Turtle used. They came on in a huge rush, tried to always to have surprise, and whatever ammunition they had, they shot up as fast as they could, and then go in right on top of them with their knives and axes and whatever else they had. Very smart tactics, because you can't beat surprise.
Of the 319 Kentucky militia present that day, over half were dead just minutes into the battle. The rest retreated in total disarray, many throwing down their arms, then bounding through the freezing but shallow Wabash into the momentary safety of the main camp lines, leaving their dead and dying comrades to the scalping knife, tomahawk, and sickening thud of war club on skull.
I'd have named that advance area hell, if in that name weren't already taken. Private Merkin Walter, 1791.
Meanwhile, another of Little Turtle's tactics was taking a deadly toll on the only advantage St. Clair's forces might have taken to the battle that day, their heavy artillery.
The great weight of the attack was directed at the center of each line, where the artillery was placed, and from which the men were repeatedly driven with great slaughter. General Arthur St. Clair.
Given the assignment of leading the attack on the U.S. artillery was Little Turtle's ferocious white son-in-law, William Wells.
And John Johnston records that Wells said that that day he killed and scalped until he could no longer lift his arm above his head.
3 horses were shot from under St. Clair. Survivors report he was seen scurrying around on his hands and knees at times, shouting instructions and encouragement when his gout-ridden legs could carry his weight no longer.
As the plan unfolded for the battle and Little Turtle's Indian Army pushed units of the Americans towards a direction of the field where they thought there might be safety, it turned out that there were more Indians waiting for them in the forest.
And by 9:30, it was all over. Colonel Dark and a bunch of brave men beat a path through the woods, and everybody just fell in behind them and headed down, and they joined the wilderness trail out here at the edge of town.
They were running wholesale to get back to Cincinnati.
They left their wounded to their fate, which was not pleasant. Those who were too wounded to make it fell along the way and to their fate, which was not pleasant.
None of the whites left behind were spared. Scores were tomahawked and scalped as the Indians took their vengeance on the living, dying, and dead without regard for age or sex.
What's the biggest loss that the white man ever incurred in the Indian battles? More people killed here, more than 950 were left on the battlefield here.
That's more than twice what Custer's last stand represented in losses to U.S. troops. It was the worst loss suffered by U.S. forces at the hands of native peoples ever.
Total American losses are nearly 1,000 dead. Over 75% of the officers were killed. Well over half the Kentucky militia and the camp followers, older men, women, and children, all did not return from the bloody banks of the Wabash that morning. As the Confederated Native Americans under the 39-year-old Little Turtle laid waste to the plans of the territorial governor, President Washington, and a young nation of land-hungry settlers.
Little Turtle instructed his warriors to go among the dead and to cram a handful of clay in the mouth of each of the dead soldiers who were around the field as a symbol of the Indians' disdain for the white man's drive to take his land.
Now George Washington wanted an iron-fisted commander to lead the nation's army and defeat the Miami Confederacy once and for all.
President Washington turned to Anthony Wayne partly because Anthony Wayne's reputation during the Revolution, he gained the nickname Mad for his impetuousness. He seemed to be crazy daring, and they lovingly called him Mad Anthony Wayne.
He and Washington weren't on too good of terms then. Washington was pretty much of a stickler for morality, and Wayne's was, he was a boozer and womanizer and had a bad reputation for it.
He seemed to be the person to turn to in these very first years of the U.S. Army, even though he was not on active duty. He had to come out of retirement. He was about 49 years old. He was overweight, had gout. He was dealing with a scandalous affair with a Miss Vining back in Philadelphia that was causing all kinds of personal problems at home, and he was very happy to come out on the frontier and deal with the Indian problems.
Wayne, now head of the entire U.S. Army, gathers his troops at Fort Washington at Cincinnati for his eventual march on Kikianga. While the Miami warriors, including William Wells, had been occupied with their campaign against St. Clair, scattered American raids against Miami villages along the lower Wabash had taken place, including a raid against Wells' own village, which would come to change his allegiance and his life forever.
When Wells returns from fighting against Sinclair, they find that their villages have been raided, their families are gone.
Traveling to Cincinnati, where the Miami prisoners were being held, Wells is hired by the U.S. government as an interpreter and successfully negotiates the release of his family and the other Miami hostages.
Seeing it, this man is very good at this. Anthony Wayne decides that what defeated Sinclair was he had no intelligence system. And Sinclair said you could never know where these Indians were going to be. So Wayne hired William Wells to act as the captain of a group of counterintelligence agents.
Further complicating Little Turtle's efforts at keeping the Miami Confederacy alive was the new Jay Treaty between the United States and England, by which the British were restricted from supplying guns and ammunition to the Native Americans.
That source of munitions, of powder and rifle, was pretty much dried up. The Turtle had made trips to Detroit and asked them for those things, stated very clearly that they had to have those things to sustain any type of fight, and they were let down.
Though Little Turtle and a band of warriors are able to destroy one of Wayne's supply trains, killing 15 Americans, Little Turtle finds that Wayne leaves no opportunity for surprise attack. When Wayne reaches the site of St. Clair's defeat, he orders that the hundreds of skulls and other remains of the dead Americans, which had been left on the field of battle, be recovered and buried. There he builds a fort and names it Fort Recovery, which the Shawnee war chief Blue Jacket attacks in June of 1794.
Blue Jacket now wanted to recreate that victory, and he was defeated. And that's the more important battle of that campaign, because then the Indians were beginning to fall into disarray. They were becoming demoralized, and Little Turtle was not among them at that point. He was not a part of the leadership that came against Anthony Wayne.
25 Americans are killed, but unlike the earlier Wilderness battle there, the Native Americans find they are unable to take Wayne's fortified garrison. Marching with his army from Fort Recovery in late July of 1794, Wayne fakes a march on Kikianga, but then turns north to the mouth of the Aglays on the Maumee, at the present-day site of Defiance, Ohio.
Brothers, be no longer deceived by the bad white men, the British, at the foot of the rapids. They have neither the power nor inclination to protect you, but in pity of your innocent women and children, prevent the further effusion of your blood. Let them experience the kindness and friendship of the United States of America. General Anthony Wayne, August 14, 1794.
The Americans are now led by a chief who never sleeps. The night and day are alike to him. During all the time he has been marching to our villages, we have never been able to surprise him. There is something whispers to me it would be prudent to listen to his offers of peace. Little Turtle, August 19, 1794.
He said, the white man is numbered like the sands along the beaches. You can't continue to fight them. Little Turtle listened to counsel. When it came time for the battle with Mad Anthony Wayne, he stepped down as war chief. A lot of people don't know that. He dressed down because he felt that they were fighting a losing battle.
Little Turtle chose not to risk everything, not to have his whole nation wiped out.
The other warriors like Tecumseh and Blue Jacket and others wanted to go on and fight, and indeed the record would show that they not only didn't fight as well as Little Turtle, they lost everything.
With Wayne now is a force of some 2,400 men, 800 of which engaged Blue Jacket and the Indians at a place called Fallen Timbers.
When Anthony Wayne attacked, he attacked in a classic outflanking maneuver that drove the Indians in on themselves. The infantry with their bayonets pushed against the Indian front ranks and panicked them. They ran back to the fort, to the British fort, and the gates were locked against them.
Although a small battle by comparison, the Battle of Fallen Timbers is decisive. Wayne is now able to march into Kikianga at Three Rivers uncontested.
On September 14th, the Legion began march for the Miami village, where we arrived at 5:00 p.m. on the 17th of September. I reconnoitered the ground and determined on that spot to build a garrison. General Anthony Wayne, 1794.
On October 22, 1794, Wayne decides the fort is sufficiently finished for its dedication ceremony. After firing 15 cannon rounds, second in command, Colonel Hamtramck, gives the garrison the name Fort Wayne in honor of General Wayne. 4 days later, Wayne marches the main body of his army back to Fort Greenville, between Fort Wayne and the Ohio River. There the following year, he calls for all tribal leaders to attend and sign the Treaty of Greenville. It gives the Americans control of key posts, but leaves the rest of the territory to the Native Americans.
That's why we signed the Treaty of Greenville, because we were assured that that old Northwest Territory we'd be in there, we would be undisturbed. This line of demarcation was the end of colonization. Everything beyond that was ours. And so we bought that, and we signed the treaty. Of course, it didn't last.
I am the first to sign this treaty, and I will be the last to break it. Little Turtle, 1795.
In Little Turtle's eloquent speech at the Treaty of Greenville, he called for peaceful existence between the Americans and the Native Americans. 3 different times, Little Turtle traveled the over 700-mile journey to the nation's capitals in Philadelphia and Washington to meet with Presidents Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, seeking better treatment for his people. Coming up, the final chapter in the life of William Wells and the courageous deeds of a real frontier heroine as Three Rivers in Time continues.
After the Treaty of Greenville, at which William Wells was an interpreter, Wells is appointed U.S. Indian agent at Fort Wayne.
William Henry Harrison, the new territorial governor, was determined to take all of the Indian land from the Indians by various treaty negotiations. Wells often got in trouble with Harrison because he was so adamant in defending Indian rights to land.
Though Wells and Little Turtle continue to work for the rights of Native Americans, Wells, now in his middle 40s, is employed by the American government.
When the war is starting to break out, the War of 1812 between Great Britain and the United States, Wells is at Fort Wayne and receives word that they are going to evacuate Fort Dearborn at the present site of Chicago. And this had a lot of impact for Wells. Wells has a white niece, Rebecca Wells Held, who has married a lieutenant who had been stationed at Fort Wayne, whom Wells knew well, and gone on to be the commander at Fort Dearborn.
Wells takes a group of 30 Miami and 1 soldier from Fort Wayne and rides to Fort Dearborn at the present-day site of Chicago to evacuate the women and children of Fort Dearborn, along with a handful of troops there.
The morning that they're to leave, Wells demonstrates so much his thinking and the culture he's accepted because he dresses in buckskin. There are lots of pictures of Wells in U.S. military uniform, but this day Wells dresses in buckskin. He paints his face black, which is the way a Miami warrior would face death. And he leads the troops out of Fort Dearborn on the evacuation route.
Outside the fort, in the sand dunes of the present-day site of Chicago, hundreds of hostile Potawatomi attack the small group led by Wells.
He kills almost as many Indians there as he had killed whites when he was fighting on the side of the Miami against Sinclair.
The troops behaved most gallantly. They were but a handful, but they seemed resolved to sell their lives as dearly as possible in our defense. Mrs. Kinsey, Battle of the Dunes, 1812.
We next see William Wells defending a wagon load of children as he charges a sand dune on horseback, loading in rapid fire a musket, charged up the sand dune against the Potawatomi, who cut him down in a fusillade of musket fire, shot his horse from under him, and then descended on him in a great whoop of triumph. And there they scalped him and they cut off his head and put it on a pike, and then tore out his heart and ceremoniously ate it on the beach of Lake Michigan.
And they paid him the greatest tribute. They took his scalp, and people said that they saw it later because he had his hair tied back. But then they took his heart, and they ate his heart to try to get his bravery, because they were saying, here is a brave man. And when his niece refused to eat part of his heart and whipped the Indian who offered it with her riding whip, they yelled apocanier or apcanet, the word for Wells, saying she is as brave as her uncle.
As was their custom, the Indians now divided the prisoners. Wells' niece and her husband, Captain Held, and another man are taken by a band of Ottawas north along Lake Michigan. Escaping in a frail bark canoe one night, the 3 paddle over 200 miles to the British-held fort on Mackinac Island. There, the British commandant allows them to reach the United States in safety. By the early 1800s, the American settlers of the Old Northwest are on an irreversible course to convert the wilderness forever.
They were determined to change that, to bring to bear the great concept of intensive farming that they had developed, struggled so hard to develop in Europe. Cut down the forest, drain the swamps, create the magnificent farms that we're so proud of today. A price was paid, and that is the elimination of the great forests of the Midwest.
For the next several years, a series of treaties advantageous to the U.S. but devastating to the Native Americans are forced on the Indians by Indiana Territorial Governor William Henry Harrison. Paying the Indians 1 or 2 cents an acre, the government sells it to new settlers for over $1 an acre. By the 1840s, Harrison had gained over 27 million acres for the U.S. government, and the Miami's homeland was gone.
And in 1840, a treaty was signed that was to move the Miami tribe to a reservation in Kansas. So Miami, of course, did not want to go. And so it was 1846, only with force and threats of force was the move made.
It could not have been a very pretty picture to divide families like that. There were occasions where people were forced onto the canal boats. They weren't going peacefully. They were going under duress, and families were being torn apart. All the things that you can imagine that you could do to stay if you wanted to stay were taking place there.
They didn't have any choice. The ones who moved had no choice at all.
When I'd finished, he was crying. And I said, "Okay, Ma, why do you cry? Head chief, why do you cry?" He said, "Two Crows, you made me see pictures. Pictures of when I was a little boy. Pictures I'd forgot that were even there. I could see my mom and dad still alive, my brothers and sisters. They're all gone now. All gone."
In the end, white culture simply overwhelmed Native American life, and it remained hidden for generations. It's encouraging to note, however, that today traditional Native American culture is being studied and practiced with pride. As a footnote regarding some of the founders of a place called Fort Wayne, Little Turtle, before he died, requested that he be placed in a traditional Miami wickiup. There he died on July 14th, 1812. In what some historians and reporters, including this one, regard as an ironic twist, he was buried by the fort garrison with full American military honors. Yet it was the highest honor the young nation could bestow on this respected enemy, then friend of the American people. His military goal accomplished, General Man Anthony Wayne left Fort Wayne never to return. He died 2 years later on December 15, 1796, of severe gout complications while inspecting northern garrisons. Before he died, however, he had secured the entire Northwest Territory for the American government and was hailed as a conqueror of the American wilderness. While we've seen that William Wells was killed in 1812, he had many children. A son, William Wayne Wells, became the first Native American to attend West Point.
Looking back even further, Francois, the younger Vincennes, who had helped build the first French fort at Kikianga, was assigned at the age of 21 to command post Ouiatenon at present-day Lafayette, then ordered further into the wilderness to live among the Miami on the lower Wabash River, where he built the post known as Vincennes in 1731. While leading his Miami allies in a raid against the British-backed Chickasaw, Vincennes himself was captured and burned at the stake, singing a hymn as the flames rose about him. But the city, Vincennes, and the high ground above it, Terre Haute, still bear their early French names. During the war for America's independence, British Colonel Henry the Hairbuyer Hamilton descended the Wabash and took the city of Vincennes for the British. But in 1779, in a daring winter surprise attack, General George Rogers Clark and his Kentucky Long Knives took back Vincennes for its American settlers. Clark became a Revolutionary War hero, and no foreign power has ever advanced so deeply into the American interior since. Tecumseh and a number of Native American followers continued to resist American advancement into the old Northwest Territory. A charismatic and persuasive leader, Tecumseh traveled from Canada to Florida in an effort to unite all Native American tribes against the advancing whites. But while Tecumseh was away, Territorial Governor William Henry Harrison and his army drew the militarily weaker brother of Tecumseh, the Prophet, and his followers into battle at Prophetstown near the Tippecanoe River. The Prophet told his warriors the white man's bullets could not harm them. But Harrison's forces won the Battle of Tippecanoe, a triumph which eventually won Harrison the presidency. Tecumseh and his remaining Indian allies joined the British during the War of 1812 in a last tragic attempt to save Native American lands. Harrison's army finally caught up with Tecumseh and the retreating British forces at the Battle of the Thames near Detroit, where Tecumseh, fighting to the end, was killed in battle.
Two more American forts were eventually built here to replace the fort that Anthony Wayne had built. One was under siege by the Potawatomi and other natives during the War of 1812, and a surprise attack by some visiting chiefs was narrowly avoided. Major Josiah Vose evacuated the final fort here in 1819. The town's residents reported that they missed the comforting music of the garrison band, but the fort system that Mad Anthony Wayne started here would eventually stretch to the Pacific Ocean. As a closing note, we'd like to point out that any look at history often raises as many interesting questions as it answers. If you'd like to learn more about the exciting time period covered on this program, a good place to start is at your local library or at the Allen County Fort Wayne Historical Museum. I'm Chris Schenkel, and we sincerely hope you've enjoyed Three Rivers in Time.
When Anthony Wayne came to the Three Rivers and built the fort, he did so on October 22nd, the anniversary of that Palmer disaster, the Battle of Kikianga. And consequently, in later years, as Fort Wayne grew from a village to a town and then into a city, that third week in October came to be the dedicatory week of a place called Fort Wayne.
To me, the fulfillment from being in Miami, I suppose, comes from an understanding of the truth and a truth to yourself and the values, because there are values that don't change.
When a person looks at themselves and they decide what their heritage is in this United States of America, which is known as the melting pot of all different cultures, that we need to allow each other to have the freedom to say who they are and what culture they're from.